Very good. Thank you, Lizzie, and thank you, Natasha, for those kind words. I really, 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 really wish I could be in Rio de Janeiro today, but for reasons that you fully understand, I'm here, not in Cordoba, but in my basement. So I will show you in just a moment where I really am. Well, I'm trying to eliminate my virtual background. It's not working, so I'll move to Oregon. This is at least closer. And now I'm going to share my screen. Okay, I hope that you can see a slide with a picture of Brazil, somewhere in Amazonia. So Natasha suggested that I explain the difference between a university professor and a professor. All that means is that officially I work for the university as a whole, and no department chair and no dean can tell me what to do. And I can teach anything I like. I'm allowed to teach brain surgery in the medical school if I want. But as a practical matter, it doesn't make very much difference. So what I'm going to focus on today is an argument that I've been making recently about how techniques of the natural sciences might change the way that we do history. I'm not sure that what I'm going to lay out is actually going to happen, but I'm suggesting that it might, and that if it does, historians need to think very carefully about how we go about our business. And I'll try to speak for no more than 20 minutes so that we can have an opportunity for discussion. So this is the outline of what I propose to do. And I'll begin with the main argument, which is the argument of that article published in the American Historical Review, which you may have read, and is the argument of the presentation that I gave a few months ago as my presidential address to the American Historical Association. So the heart of the argument is that the relative significance of textual documents for historical work is going to decline. And that's not because the quantity of documents in the future will be any less than it is now. Quite the contrary, the quantity of documents will increase considerably. But the significance of those documents in comparison to other kinds of information is probably going to decrease. And the only reason for that is because the other kinds of information are pouring forth in a flood from various corners of the natural sciences. And I mentioned a few of them here. Paleogenomics, that is the study of ancient DNA, or as it's called sometimes, aDNA. The study of the residues of proteins, called proteomics. New techniques, technologically intensive techniques in archaeology, such as the use of LiDAR, which I'll speak about a little bit today. and also technologically intensive historical linguistics, so-called computational historical linguistics, where all sorts of things can be done that 20 years ago could not be done in linguistics because it requires tremendous amounts of computer power to do it. There's one picture on this slide I want to draw your attention to, the one that's not so colorful. The colorful one is documents. The not so colorful one is a LiDAR image from a place in England called the Forest of Dean. And what you're looking at is what is underneath the forest. Imagery generated by pulses from, in this case, a drone. Pulses that measure the distance between the surface and a receiver in that drone and allow three-dimensional mapping of what lies underneath vegetation. And what lies underneath this vegetation in the Forest of Dean is an old plowed field. And you might very well not be able to see that if you were walking through the forest, but you can see it with LiDAR. And here's another picture, this one from Guatemala. This is a three-dimensional mapping of a Maya landscape done a couple of years ago, in which, as you can read for yourself, 60,000 new structures were revealed. And archaeologists are going to go and dig and learn more about the Maya world. But without even having done that, they have revised upwards their estimates of Maya population in the 8th, 9th, and 10th centuries, upwards by about 50%. And that's on the basis of LiDAR done over a small proportion of the Maya world. So in some parts of the world, I think LiDAR in particular is going to be revolutionary. So here's my second point, that taking all these techniques together from the natural sciences is going to change the capabilities of historians, particularly as regards earlier time periods for which written documents are normally fewer. It's going to change the capabilities of historians with respect to certain parts of the world more than others, those parts of the world for which written documents are rare, and those parts of the world where there's a lot of forest cover today that LiDAR can in effect see through with its lasers. Parts of the world where people were not burned, their bodies not burned upon death, but they were buried and they can be excavated and analyzed with new techniques of molecular biology. Parts of the world where the existing populations don't object if scientists examine the skeletons and tissues of their ancestors. And there's some places where people do object, quite understandably. So it's going to have, I think, a very uneven impact in expanding the capabilities of historians, uneven geographically. On top of that, it's going to be uneven geographically, partly because these new techniques from the natural sciences are comparatively expensive, more expensive than you or me looking at documents, no matter how well paid you or I might be. And if I'm right about this, and if it doesn't change, then research institutes with big budgets will be able to do more kinds of things than everybody else. I mean, they already can do more kinds of things than everybody else, but the meaning of that will be accentuated and expanded. I also think it will be uneven in terms of which subfields of history are altered most. And I would go so far as to say which subfields of history become the most intellectually exciting and turbulent. And I think it's going to be areas including environmental history. As I write here, health, disease, migration, settlement, urban history, agricultural history, environmental history. All of these, I think, stand to be illuminated much more by work coming out of the natural sciences than does intellectual history, for example. Now, I could be wrong about this. I don't want to underestimate the ingenuity of historians, and I don't want to underestimate the ingenuity of people using new techniques. So I could be quite wrong, and intellectual history could be amongst the most exciting areas revolutionized by new methodologies. But at the moment, it doesn't look like that to me. So if I'm right about this, and the techniques of history research are going to change substantially in the decades ahead, it has implications for how we train historians and how people educate themselves as historians. So one of the problems is how much of the paleosciences does a historian need to learn to be literate, to be capable of understanding the findings that come from genetics or come from palynology, the study of fossil pollen, or come from historical linguistics? And how much does a historian need in order to collaborate with scholars trained in these particular subdisciplines? That's not clear. One way of thinking about it is what historians have always done with languages. So most of us need to learn additional languages in order to be historians. How many? And how well do you need to learn them? That's not necessarily obvious. It depends on what kind of history you wish to do. But when one is in school and training, one doesn't necessarily know exactly what kinds of history that one will do in the next 10 years or 20 years or 30 years. So it's not obvious which languages one needs to learn when one is young. And it's not obvious which of the paleosciences one might wish to try to learn. These things are open questions. Some guidance might be found in the experience of Africanists, because Africanists have never had many texts to work with. And they've had to be very ingenious. And so, as you know, they use oral history more than almost any other historians do. And most of them need to learn at least some of the basics of archaeology. And they need to be able to evaluate arguments made from historical linguistics. Training to be an Africanist, or at least a pre-colonial Africanist, is something of a decathlon. One has to learn a lot more sub-disciplines than historians like me, who were trained to analyze texts. So it may be that Africanists have shown us something of the way that many of the rest of us might need to follow, particularly in environmental history. But it is so hard to know what one might need 10 years, 20 years from now. And it's also the case that the techniques of the paleosciences are going to change, so that what one could learn now will probably be out of date in 20 years, which is not really so much the case with analyzing texts. There are, of course, different ways to analyze texts, and different approaches have been influential at different times within the historical profession. It's not as if there's only one way to do textual history. But the changes in the paleosciences in the last 20 years are very dramatic, and I would expect that in the next 20 years they'll be equally dramatic. And that makes it hard to train oneself now in a way that will be valid and useful 20 years from now. So one answer to that is what I refer to here as training sabbaticals. If we could organize careers, whether they're academic careers, museum careers, public history careers, so that historians could, if they want to, take some time off from their day-to-day duties and study the new methods, whether that's in the paleosciences or maybe something else. That would make us all better historians. I understand there are lots of obstacles to this. But at least conceptually, it seems to me an appropriate way to address the problem. These two pictures, one of them is a phylogenetic tree of the pathogen behind the plague. I can't really read this, but one of Natasha's other teachers, my colleague Tim Newfield, he can read these. It makes him a better historian. The other image is a pollen diagram from a lake in Ontario. And I recently had my undergraduate students try to use this as a historical document. And of course, I had to teach them a little bit about palynology and what these scientific terms mean. But the most interesting ones, let's see if I can get my cursor here. Zea, this is maize, or what Americans often call corn. And this is interesting because it represents the beginnings of agriculture in Ontario, right around this point in time. A few hundred years of maize agriculture, and then no maize agriculture, and then a resumption of maize agriculture. These are grasses, including cereal grains, but other kinds of grasses as well. This here is ragweed, which is a very, it's a species that is an indicator of disturbance in landscapes. So right here we see strong signals. Most of this is going to be cereal cultivation, wheat, and this is disturbance of the landscape and a new species invading. This probably represents rapid deforestation. The end of maize cultivation around here probably represents the near annihilation of the indigenous population of this part of Ontario, followed by hundreds of years in which there was no cultivation. So you can see something of the human history of this part of Ontario in this diagram if you only know a teeny bit about the species. So that's what I've been trying to teach my students at the very end of this last semester. I'm not sure whether they like it or not. But most of them were able to figure things out well enough on their final exams. So some more implications. I've mentioned already that these techniques in the natural sciences are expensive. Now, they're getting cheaper, but they're still expensive. And my guess is that the new ones that will emerge will also be expensive. And so one of the possible implications is that only the richest institutions will be able to do this kind of historical research, which I sometimes refer to as hyperhistory. That would be extremely unfortunate, but I think it's a possibility that we need to confront. A second implication is that because it's so hard to learn much about so many disciplines in the natural sciences, that historians may need to get more accustomed to working in teams and working in interdisciplinary teams, which has a lot of difficulties associated with it. But it might be something that we need to get used to. Do we need different kinds of institutions to conduct hyperhistory as opposed to the institutions that historians have worked in for 150 years doing text-based history? My guess is that the answer is probably yes. The picture here is an example of, let's say, an imperfect effort to bring the natural sciences to bear on historical research in Jena. And I like the image because there are two different buildings here connected by a passageway, and the two different buildings are excellent representations of a building that looks like it's built for science and a building that looks like it's built for humanists or lawyers, and they're connected. Now, so the symbolism is good. The reality is that this institution is dominated by people trained in the natural sciences, and they occasionally consult text-based historians, but it's not an equal partnership. But I think we do need to find a way to create institutions in which all these various approaches to the past can work together without one set dominating the other. And we need to be able to build institutions that will bridge the so-called divide between the two cultures. Two cultures here, I'm referring to a concept that has been in circulation since the 1950s. A British academic named C.P. Snow argued that there was a humanist culture and a scientific culture, and they didn't understand one another. And there's a good deal of truth in that. But collaboration and teamwork is full of difficulties, especially when it is across disciplines. So as I've written here, who gets to define the research questions? Where do the results get published? Is it in the American Historical Review, or is it in the Journal of Mass Spectrometry? And different collaborators would have different preferences. So there are a lot of problems, as I see it, in the mismatch between what I foresee happening in historical research and the institutional frameworks that we have in existence. So those are some of the pitfalls to this, pitfalls of collaboration and teamwork. But there's some other pitfalls too. And one of those, perhaps the greatest among them, is the uncritical acceptance of results and data and interpretations arising from disciplines or subdisciplines that one doesn't know very well. And I think I'm probably guilty of this from time to time. I get very excited about some of the new findings from the geneticists or the archaeologists, but sometimes I'm not as careful as I should be about being cautious and inquiring into the methods and asking people who really know whether these methods are applied properly or not, particularly when it comes to genetics research, paleogenomics. I'm helpless. And I can be easily persuaded in my naivete. I need help. Fortunately, I have people I can turn to get help. But that seems to be a big risk. And the only way around it is to be educated in everything. And that's not going to happen for most of us. Another pitfall that seems to me underappreciated by the specialists in paleogenomics and archaeology and so forth is what I refer to here as the neglect of context, a sense of feel for a place. So traditional historians and traditional anthropologists and traditional geographers, if they're going to study a subject, they go somewhere in order to study it, and they live there. And by doing that, they learn things that they're not explicitly trying to learn, but they just happen to learn because they're living there for a while. And that doesn't happen if your research is based on the interpretation of LiDAR imagery or ancient DNA samples. So something's lost that way. Now, mind you, something is lost, the same thing is lost if one does one's research on Brazilian history and one consults the digitized online archives and doesn't go live in Brazil for a couple of years. And of course, a larger and larger proportion of text-based historical research is done through digitized archives, which is great in one sense because it's cheaper, it democratizes access, but it also means that the context, the feel for a place, the feel for a culture is minimized, except when people are doing the research about the place where they already live. There are probably more pitfalls that are hard to see right now, but will become evident if indeed more and more of historical research relies more and more on techniques from the natural sciences. So there are a lot of things to worry about, but at the same time, I think historians have to prepare themselves for this, have to try to educate themselves to deal with evidence tumbling forth from laboratories. Because if we don't do it, we're going to lose a lot of our influence over the way the past is understood, the way the past is interpreted, the way the past is used. And we will lose it both to the natural scientists themselves, which means that they will be offering naive interpretations without contexts. And we will also lose it to science journalists who frequently serve as the interface between natural scientists and the reading public, because most natural scientists find it difficult to communicate in ways that people outside their specialization can understand. So that's why I think it's important that we face up to this and prepare ourselves collectively, maybe change the way that we train the rising generation, try to change the institutional structures in which we operate, and try to expand our own capabilities as historians so as to be more sophisticated in the way that we deal with new data and new interpretations. It's tempting to ignore all that and just do what we know how to do, but I fear that that is a recipe for reducing our relevance and significance, and in fact our numbers within the world of research and science and academia and intellectual life generally. So let me conclude by saying I have these concerns and worries, but I also find it enormously exciting that we're getting so much new information, and we're going to get so much new information, particularly about times and places that we don't know much about. And that has considerable application, I think, to Brazilian history, where there are no texts before 1500, and there are large parts of the country for which texts before 1900 are comparatively scarce. And yet, there were people, there was history. How do we get at it? Well, non-textual approaches should be useful and revealing. Perhaps LiDAR above all others. Okay, that's all I've got to say. Thanks for your patience, and I'll now do my best to cope with whatever questions or quarrels you might have.